vivid verses.
I keep two notebooks, one for work, project timelines, contractor bids, material costs. The other is personal, and I've had it since my late 20s when I realized that the clearest thinking I ever do happens in the hour before sleep, when the noise of the day has settled and what remains is what actually matters. I'm not a man who dwells. I observe, I record, I move. That discipline has served me well in the 12 years I've spent building Halloran Construction into something I'm genuinely proud of, a mid-sized firm with a reputation for doing what we say we'll do, on time, within budget, without drama. We're not the largest outfit in Carver Falls. We're the most trusted. I chose that deliberately. My name is Connor Halloran. I'm 38 years old. I own a house on Ridgecroft Lane with a back porch that faces west, which means I get the best sunsets in the city for free. I drive a practical truck and a less practical car, and I've never felt the need to apologize for either. I play chess on Tuesday nights at Brennan's Bar with a retired civil engineer named Abe who has beaten me exactly 41 times in 3 years and reminds me of this constantly. I cook on Sundays. I sleep 8 hours. I run 4 miles every morning before the world wakes up. I tell you all of this because the story I'm about to share is not really about weakness. It's about the particular blindness that can settle over a man who believes he's paying attention, when really he's only paying attention to the things that confirm what he already wants to believe. I met Vanessa Cortland at a fundraiser for the Carver Falls Architectural Preservation Society. It was held at the Aldenmore Hotel, a beautiful old building I'd helped restore 3 years prior. And I was there partly out of civic obligation and partly because my project manager, Greta, had guilted me into buying 2 tickets and then conveniently come down with a cold the night of the event. Vanessa was standing near the scale model of the old Halverson Theater, which the Society was trying to save from demolition. She had a glass of sparkling water in one hand and was leaning slightly forward, studying the model with what looked like genuine interest. I noticed the posture before I noticed anything else. The way she held herself, attentive and self-contained, like someone who didn't need to perform interest because she actually had it. We talked for 2 hours that night. She was 34, a brand consultant who'd built her own small firm, Cortland Creative, after a decade working for a larger agency in the city. She was articulate and funny in a dry, quiet way, and she knew enough about historic architecture to hold up her side of a real conversation on the subject. She asked good questions. She listened to the answers. I drove home that night and wrote 4 lines in my personal notebook. Smart, self-made, easy presence, follow up. I followed up. The first 6 months were, by any honest measure, excellent. We were both busy people who understood that busyness was not neglect. We had dinner twice a week, usually at Faro, the small Italian place on Clement Street that doesn't take reservations and doesn't need to. We took a weekend trip to the coast in March, staying at a rented cottage outside Pelham Bay, where it rained continuously and we didn't much care. She met Abe at Brennan's one Tuesday and held her own in a conversation about urban zoning that impressed him visibly, which is not easy to do. I liked her. More than liked her, if I'm being precise. There was a quality of steadiness in her early on, an absence of performance, that I found rare and genuinely attractive. I'm not a man who falls quickly, and I didn't fall quickly then. What I did was open a door, slowly and deliberately, and allow someone to walk through it. She moved some things into my house in the fall. A drawer became a section of the closet, became a key on her keyring. These were incremental, comfortable progressions. Nothing alarming. I noted them with the same calm attention I give everything and found nothing to flag. The first inconsistency appeared in November. A small thing, barely worth noting, except that I noted everything. I had been negotiating a significant contract with Vanterra Properties, a real estate development group, looking to build a mixed-use complex on the old rail yard north of downtown. It was the kind of project that comes along once every several years, the sort that doesn't just bring revenue, it establishes a firm's capability at a new scale. I'd spent 6 weeks preparing the bid, working closely with my structural engineer, Ray Okada, and my site coordinator, Priya Chun. Vanessa knew about the project in broad strokes. I don't discuss proprietary bid details with anyone outside the firm. That's a standing rule, not a specific caution. But she knew I was pursuing it, knew it was important, and had expressed what seemed like genuine support. In November, at a small dinner party hosted by our mutual friends Leo and Sylvie Marsh, she made an offhand comment while I was refilling my water glass. I didn't hear the beginning of it. What I caught, returning to the table, was the tail end. I keep telling him he should take on a partner. Running it alone is ego, really. Leo caught my eye briefly. He said nothing. I sat down, and the conversation moved on. Running it alone. The phrase circled in my head on the drive home. I hadn't discussed taking on a partner with Vanessa. Not once. Not in any form. It wasn't on the table. It wasn't something I'd expressed ambivalence about. It was a position I hadn't held, expressed to people in my social circle as though it were a known source of reasonable disagreement between us. I didn't raise it that night. I filed it. The Vantera bid came in successfully in December. We won the contract. It was, professionally, one of the best moments of my career, and I felt it as such, quietly, with a particular kind of satisfaction that doesn't require an audience. Vanessa's response, when I told her over dinner, was warm on the surface. She raised her glass. She said the right things. But she also, within minutes, pivoted to a project of her own, a rebranding campaign for a hospitality group, and the pivot was fast enough that I registered it. Not with suspicion, exactly. Just registration. I filed it. The comments about professional decisions began in January, and they followed a consistent pattern I can describe clearly now, though I was slower to name in the moment. They never came as direct challenges. Vanessa was too intelligent for direct challenges. They came as questions, reasonable sounding, slightly weighted questions, delivered in front of others. At dinner with Ray and his wife, Tomoko, she asked whether I'd considered the reputational risk of taking on a project at that scale, given that we'd never really operated above a certain threshold. At a small gathering at Priya's apartment, she mentioned to the group that I was a perfectionist about control, which was positioned as affection but functioned as a qualifier, the kind that makes a room tilt slightly toward doubt. The pattern, when I laid it out in my notebook, was clear. Each comment landed where my professional reputation lived. Each one was deniable individually. Collectively, they were a campaign. Here's what I want to say carefully. I am not a man who assumes the worst. I believe in extending good faith longer than most people think is wise, because I've seen the damage done by premature suspicion. But I'm also a man who trusts what I can observe and document over what I'm told to feel. I observed. I documented. I also paid attention to what changed in her behavior during this period. She was more frequently late for plans, more easily distracted during conversations, more likely to check her phone at dinner. Nothing dramatic. Small erosions. The kind that are designed, whether consciously or not, to be survivable individually and devastating in accumulation. In February, during a conversation about the Vantera timeline, she told me directly that she thought I was overextending and that I should honestly consider whether this is the right time. I asked her, calmly, what specific information she was basing that on. She said she was just being honest with someone who cared about me. I told her I appreciated the care and that I'd made my decision. She let it go for about a week. In March, she asked about the joint account. I want to be transparent about my own reasoning here because it matters to the story. I'm not a careless man with money. I have separate accounts for business and personal use. I work with a financial advisor named Philip Reese at Crestwood Financial, and I am, by habit and conviction methodical. The idea of adding anyone to a personal account was not something I would have agreed to quickly under normal circumstances. But the ask was well constructed. It came after a good week between us, during a quiet Sunday evening at home. She framed it around a specific scenario. She was potentially going to be traveling more for Cortland Creative's new client, and there had been a situation the previous year, before we were together, where she'd been abroad and her own accounts had frozen due to a fraud alert, and she'd been stranded without access to funds. It was a reasonable story. It was the kind of story that maps neatly onto practical concern. She wasn't asking to be added to my primary account or my business accounts. She was asking about what I kept at Thornfield Bank, a secondary personal account I used for household expenses and discretionary spending. I thought about it. I told her I'd consider it. I consulted Philip, who raised an eyebrow and said it was my call, but that he'd recommend a dedicated shared account instead. I thought about Philip's suggestion. I thought about the pattern I'd been filing in my notebook. And then I made a mistake. I'm not going to dress it up or make it complicated. The mistake was this. I let the closeness we had built override the signals I had been carefully observing. I convinced myself that the comments about my professional decisions were a friction I could address directly, and I was planning to. I told myself that the account was small enough that the risk was manageable. I told myself that extending trust was not the same as being naive. I added her to the Thornfield account in March. There was just over $42,000 in it. The professional undermining didn't stop after the account. If anything, it became slightly more direct. In April, at a dinner with Leo and Sylvie and two other couples I knew through the Architectural Society, she told a story about a contractor she'd worked with once who couldn't separate his identity from his company, which was directed at me as obliquely as a spotlight. Leo changed the subject. I didn't react. I made a note. The following week, I had a meeting with Greta and Ray and Priya to review the Vantera Project's Phase 1 timeline. We were ahead of schedule, which is not as common as people think and which I never take for granted. Priya asked me afterward, privately, whether everything was all right. She noticed I seemed somewhere else in the meeting. I told her the project was fine and that she should flag it immediately if she ever noticed it affecting my judgment on decisions. She nodded and didn't push it. I drove home that night and sat on the back porch for a long time, watching the last of the April light thin out over the ridge. I thought about the two notebooks. I thought about the consistent pattern across 6 months. I thought about what the next 6 months would look like if the pattern continued. Then I thought about something I'd read once, that in any system, you could sustain a gradual erosion for a long time if each individual loss is small enough to absorb. The goal isn't to cause one catastrophic failure. It's to lower your capacity gradually enough that by the time the actual blow arrives, you're no longer operating at full strength. I understood, sitting on that porch, that I had been watching a process without naming the process. I named it that night. The following Saturday, I ended the relationship. I did it at my house in the evening, and I want to describe it accurately because I think the manner of it matters. I wasn't angry. Anger would have been a luxury I couldn't afford because anger gives the other person a surface to push back against. It hands them a narrative, the irrational man, the overreaction, the emotion without cause. I wasn't going to give her that. I told her that I'd been observing a pattern over the past several months that I was not willing to continue. I described it specifically. The public comments positioning my professional judgment as flawed, the framing of my independence as ego, the steady pressure to second-guess decisions I'd arrived at carefully. I told her that the pattern was consistent enough to be deliberate, and that regardless of whether it was deliberate, it was no longer acceptable to me. She disputed it. That was expected. She said I was misinterpreting things, that she was only trying to support me, that I had always been too closed off to hear honest feedback. The words were familiar. I'd watched the argument build toward this shape for weeks. I let her finish. Then I said, I've heard what you're saying. I don't agree with your characterization. This isn't a negotiation. She asked if I was being serious. I told her I was. She left an hour later. I went to bed and slept 8 hours. The following week was quiet. She sent 2 messages, the first measured and sad in tone, the second more pointed, questioning my emotional availability and suggesting I'd never really been present in the relationship. I read both carefully. I did not respond to either. I had nothing to add that would serve a constructive purpose, and I have never found value in relitigating endings. I checked the Thornfield account on Wednesday of that week, 5 days after we'd broken up, out of routine, not out of suspicion. I check all my accounts on Wednesdays. Philip installed that habit in me years ago, the way a good advisor installs habits before you need them. The account showed a balance of $411. I sat with that number for a long moment. 42,000 down to 400 and change. I opened the transaction history. There were 11 withdrawals made over 4 days, each just below the threshold that would trigger an automatic fraud alert at Thornfield. The last one had been made that morning. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because it is perhaps the most important part of this story. What I felt was not rage. What I felt was not devastation. What I felt was a cold, focused clarity, the kind that comes when something you had theorized is confirmed by evidence. There is a particular quality to that moment, not unlike the sensation of a key turning cleanly in a lock. Unpleasant, yes. Clear, absolutely. I closed the laptop. I poured a glass of water. I sat down with my notebook. I wrote 3 lines. Account drained. Withdrawals structured below alert threshold. This is now a legal matter. Then I picked up the phone and called Philip Reese. Philip didn't panic. He's not that kind of advisor, which is why I've worked with him for 9 years. He told me to call the bank immediately, document everything I had, and get to my attorney before close of business. He also told me not to contact Vanessa directly, for reasons he articulated clearly. Any communication from me could be characterized as harassment, could complicate the legal process, and would almost certainly provide her with information about my next steps. I already knew this, but it's useful to have someone confirm your reasoning when the stakes are elevated. Not because you doubt yourself, but because precision matters. I called Thornfield Bank. I spoke to a fraud officer named Mr. Carver. I remember the name because of the coincidence with the city, who was professional and thorough. I explained the situation. I was clear that the account holder had had legitimate access up until the point of removal from the account, which I had initiated at 9 a.m. that morning, prior to the final withdrawal. He asked whether I wanted to file an official report. I said yes. I then called my attorney, a woman named Frances Kwan in Belmore on Ashford Avenue. Frances has represented my business interests for 6 years and is the sharpest person I know in any room. I reached her before 4 o'clock. I laid out the facts plainly: the account access, the structured withdrawals, the timing, the relationship context. She asked 2 questions, both precise, both useful. Then she said, "Don't call her. Don't message her. Don't have anyone else contact her informally. This goes through me." I said, "Understood." I did one last thing. I sent Vanessa a single message. 9 words. This is now a legal matter. All communication goes through attorneys. I sent it, set the phone face down on the kitchen table, and went out for a run. I want to describe the days that followed because I think they reveal something important about the value of having a system you trust before you need it. Frances moved quickly. The police report, combined with the bank's own documentation of the structured withdrawals, gave her a clear foundation. There's a legal concept called theft by deception that applied to elements of the situation, and Frances pursued it with the kind of calm, documented ferocity that I deeply admire in a professional. She also filed for civil recovery, which is the mechanism by which I would seek the return of the funds. Through Frances, I learned that Vanessa had retained her own attorney, a reasonable choice and one I had expected. The communications that followed between the two legal teams were, by all accounts, productive in the way that legal communications become productive when the documentation is overwhelming and the alternative is a criminal proceeding. Philip, meanwhile, walked me through the financial cleanup. We rebuilt the Thornfield account's security protocols, removed any remaining shared access across all my accounts, a step I should have taken on the day we separated, and reviewed the broader picture to ensure nothing else had been touched. Nothing had. The Thornfield account had been the target, presumably because it was the one she had access to and the one I'd been least careful about monitoring in the week after the breakup. I was sleeping 8 hours every night throughout this period. I was running every morning. I played chess with Abe on Tuesday, lost twice in a row because I was distracted in the mid-game, and told him so directly. He said, "Whatever it is, you'll solve it," and then went back to studying the board. I appreciated that more than I said. The settlement came through in 6 weeks. Frances recovered $38,000 for $100, most of it, not all. The remaining amount had been spent in ways that made full recovery impractical, and Frances advised me to weigh the cost of further pursuit against the diminishing returns. I waited. I let it go. The decision came with a condition that was standard in such arrangements. No further contact, no public statements, a mutual agreement that made further legal exposure a clear deterrent on both sides. Frances reviewed every line. I signed where she told me to sign. Vanessa and I never spoke again. Leo called me in June, a month after the settlement. We met for coffee at a place called Canopy on Westfield Street that he likes for reasons I've never fully understood. The coffee is mediocre and the chairs are uncomfortable, but I went because Leo is a good man and a real friend, and those are worth a mediocre coffee. He said, with some difficulty, that he'd seen things at that dinner back in November that he wished he'd said something about. That he'd heard the comment about the partner and had caught its angle and had chosen to let the moment pass. He said he wasn't sure why, and that it had bothered him since. I told him I appreciated that, and that I didn't hold it against him. I meant both things. People read dynamics at the speed of real time, and social situations apply enormous pressure towards smoothing rather than naming. Leo is perceptive and decent. He'd simply made the same calculation I'd made for months, that the cost of addressing it was higher than the cost of absorbing it. We were both wrong about that, but I understood the error from the inside. He asked how I was doing. I told him I was fine, not in the way people say they're fine when they mean the opposite, but in the actual way. The project was ahead of schedule. Philip had restructured some of my accounts in ways that were, if anything, an improvement over before. I'd lost some money and some months, and I'd gained a considerably sharper operational picture of my own vulnerabilities. He laughed a little at that, and then he asked whether I regretted it. The relationship, the account access, all of it. I thought about it honestly before answering. I regret the account, I said. The relationship, I don't regret. It taught me things I needed to learn. I want to say something about the professional dimension of this, because it is not incidental to the story. The Vantera project entered Phase 2 in June. Greta, Ray, and Priya had delivered Phase 1 at 94% of projected budget and 3 days ahead of schedule. The structural work was being called out by people in the industry. Crestwood Financial had used the project as a case study in a regional development panel. Philip mentioned it with the particular pride of someone who has watched a client grow and considers it partly his own work, which I find touching and appropriate. When I look at what the professional undermining was actually targeting, my confidence in my own judgment, my relationships with my team, my willingness to take on projects at the scale I was capable of, I find that it didn't work. not because I was invulnerable to it. I felt the friction of it. I noticed it landing here and there in moments of decision where a voice in my head asked whether I was overextending. That voice wasn't always mine. What neutralized it was documentation. The practice of writing things down, of maintaining the record, meant that I couldn't gaslight myself about what I'd observed. The pattern was in the notebook, and the notebook didn't change its story. That's the value of a system. It persists when your emotional state doesn't. In August, Priya flagged something in the Phase 2 supply chain that I wouldn't have caught for another 2 weeks. It would have cost us about 8 days and a meaningful overrun. She caught it because she trusted her own observation enough to bring it to me immediately, which she might not have done a year ago. We'd built that trust deliberately, through a year of me receiving her concerns without defensiveness and following up on everyone that warranted follow-up. I told her the catch was excellent work. She said it was nothing. I told her it wasn't nothing. That's why I was saying so. That's a small moment. I include it because I think the texture of a professional life is made of small moments far more than large ones, and because the contrast with what I'd been living through was stark in a way that clarified things for me. Building something with people who are honest with you, that's not a background condition. That's the work. September brought the first real cold, which in Carver Falls means the mornings change character completely. Running in September is different from running in July. There's a sharpness to the air that makes thought cleaner. I run the same route every morning, down Ridgecroft Lane, left on Canfield Avenue, through Birchmore Park, back up along the service road behind the old mill building home. For miles, about 34 minutes on a good day. I was running that route in mid-September when I put together something I'd been turning over since the breakup. It's not a dramatic insight, more of an accumulation that finally found its shape. I had been in a relationship with someone who recognized that my primary investment was in what I built, professionally and personally, and who understood, quite shrewdly, that the most efficient way to acquire a piece of that was not to attack it directly, but to participate in it. The account access was the overt move, the one that left a paper trail. But I think the longer game, had it continued, would have looked like a gradual repositioning of my professional narrative, someone else's fingerprint on my decisions, my reputation and my circle becoming something debated rather than assumed. The structured withdrawals were, in a way, a failure of patience. Whatever the longer plan might have been, it collapsed when the relationship ended, and the fallback was a grab at the one concrete thing available, the account. I'm not interested in attributing motives I can't prove. What I have is the observable record, and the record is sufficient. What I find genuinely interesting, looking back, is the architecture of it, the intelligence involved. I don't say that to be generous. I say it because I think it's important to be accurate about the capability of the opposition. Underestimating people who are working against you is its own kind of arrogance, and I try to be free of arrogance in my assessments. September brought the first real cold, which in Carver Falls means the mornings change character completely. Running in September is different from running in July. There's a sharpness to the air that makes thought cleaner. I run the same route every morning, down Ridgecroft Lane, left on Canfield Avenue, through Birchmore Park, back up along the service road behind the old mill building home. For miles, about 34 minutes on a good day. I was running that route in mid-September when I put together something I'd been turning over since the breakup. It's not a dramatic insight, more of an accumulation that finally found its shape. I had been in a relationship with someone who recognized that my primary investment was in what I built, professionally and personally, and who understood, quite shrewdly, that the most efficient way to acquire a piece of that was not to attack it directly, but to participate in it. The account access was the overt move, the one that left a paper trail. But I think the longer game, had it continued, would have looked like a gradual repositioning of my professional narrative, someone else's fingerprints on my decisions, my reputation and my circle becoming something debated rather than assumed. The structured withdrawals were, in a way, a failure of patience. Whatever the longer plan might have been, it collapsed when the relationship ended, and the fallback was a grab at the one concrete thing available, the account. I'm not interested in attributing motives I can't prove. What I have is the observable record, and the record is sufficient. What I find genuinely interesting, looking back, is the architecture of it, the intelligence involved. I don't say that to be generous. I say it because I think it's important to be accurate about the capability of the opposition. Underestimating people who are working against you is its own kind of arrogance, and I try to be free of arrogance in my assessments. The other thing I noticed, running through Birchmore Park in September, I'd done everything right once the problem was named. The police report, the attorney, the bank, the single message. No confrontation, no negotiation, no appeals. I treated it as exactly what it was, a legal matter, and I'd handed it to the appropriate professionals and let them work. That's not a story of winning. It's a story of not losing more than I had to. I hold those as different things. Philip and I had our quarterly review in October at his office on Crestwood Boulevard. He had a new assistant who made coffee that was considerably better than Canopy's. We went through the numbers, the Vantera projections, the account restructuring, the recovery from the Thornfield situation. At the end of the meeting, he closed his folder and said, "You handled this as well as you could have." I asked him what he meant by as well as you could have, given that I'd let someone access the account in the first place. He thought about it. "I mean the part you controlled," he said. "After the mistake." That felt accurate. I accepted it. The second notebook got a new section in the fall. I'm not going to describe it in detail because it's private and because what's in it belongs to me and the process of thinking, not to a narrative conclusion. But I'll say that it contains a set of protocols, not paranoid ones, not the kind that close you off from normal human trust, but considered ones. The specific conditions under which certain kinds of access are extended. The specific checkpoints at which I review whether what I'm observing matches what I'm being told. The practice of naming patterns, not just logging them. I'd had pieces of those protocols before. The mistake with the account had come from suspending them selectively in one particular domain for reasons I'd told myself were reasonable at the time. They weren't unreasonable reasons. They were insufficient ones. There's a difference. In November, a full year after I'd first heard the comment about the partner, I went to Leo and Sylvie's house for dinner. The same circle, Ray and Tomoko, Priya and her partner, a couple I didn't know well named the Wakahisas who turned out to be excellent company. Sylvie made a lamb dish that I asked for the recipe for, and have since made twice, imperfectly. The evening was easy in the way that evenings are easy when everyone at the table is there, because they want to be and not because they're maintaining an impression. We talked about the city, about a proposed development on the harbor that Ray thought was structurally irresponsible and described in growing technical detail, until Tomoko put her hand on his arm and said enough, and he looked briefly chastened and then continued for one more sentence anyway, which made everyone laugh. Leo caught my eye at one point during the evening, I don't remember what we were talking about, and gave me a small nod. Not loaded with meaning, just present. The kind of acknowledgement that doesn't need language. I drove home along Canfield Avenue, windows down because November in Carver Falls has a particular clarity that I like, and I thought about the year. The professional wins, which had been considerable. The loss, which had been real but survivable. The things I'd learned about my own judgment, where it was reliable, where it had gaps, where it needed the support of the system rather than the confidence of instinct. I thought about the two notebooks, about the value of writing things down, about the difference between observing and naming, about how a man who never reacts in anger and never pleads and never plays the wrong party can still absorb real damage, and how the damage is not the story. What you do with it is the story. I got home and let myself into the house and stood in the front hall for a moment, the way I sometimes do when I've been thinking and need the room to settle around me before I move again. The house was quiet. The back porch faced west, as it always had. In November, by the time I came home from an evening out, the sun was long gone, and the sky was that particular deep blue that hangs for a few minutes before it darkens entirely. I stood at the back door and watched it. Then I opened my notebook, the personal one, found a clean page, and wrote the date. Below it, I wrote, "The account is rebuilt. The project is on track. The record is accurate. Move." I closed the notebook. I went to bed. I slept 8 hours.
Thanks for listening.